The Culture Map, Breaking Through the Invisible Boundaries of Global Business by Erin Meyer. You operate in a world where culture shapes every conversation, decision, and negotiation, often without you realizing it. Miscommunication isn't always about language. It's about how cultures perceive hierarchy, time, context, and directness. Erin Meyer dismantles these invisible barriers in the Culture Map, arming you with a framework for navigating global business with precision. You can't afford to assume that your way is the universal way. Americans value direct feedback, while Japanese professionals soften criticism. French teams engage in heated debates as a sign of engagement, while Swedes find confrontation abrasive. These differences determine success or failure in leadership, collaboration, and decision-making. Meyer spent years studying executives across the world, documenting the unspoken rules that define how people work. You must move beyond stereotypes and see culture as a navigational tool, not an obstacle. The way you give feedback, manage hierarchy, and interpret silence could be the reason a deal fails or succeeds. Understanding these rules isn't optional. It's the difference between leading a team that thrives and one that collapses under confusion. Lesson 1. Communicate with context. You think words carry the message, but in many cultures, the real meaning hides between the lines. The way people communicate isn't universal, and assuming otherwise is the fastest way to create confusion, frustration, or outright failure. Low-context cultures, like the US and Germany, rely on explicit language. They say exactly what they mean, with no expectation that the listener will fill in the gaps. High-context cultures, like Japan and China, assume shared knowledge. Subtlety and nonverbal cues will complete the message. If you don't know how to navigate this difference, you will misunderstand not just what is said, but, more importantly, what isn't. A German executive once told a Japanese colleague, "Your report is unclear." The Germans saw this as direct, constructive feedback, an invitation to improve. The Japanese executive, raised in a culture where criticism is delivered indirectly and softened through subtle cues, perceived this as an insult, a personal attack on competence. The relationship suffered, not because of the content of the feedback, but because of how it was communicated. This dynamic repeats itself across the world in business, diplomacy, and everyday interactions. Look at the failure of the 1999 Mars Climate Orbiter mission. A miscommunication between NASA engineers and their contractor, Lockheed Martin, led to a disastrous mistake. One team used metric measurements, while the other used imperial. The result? A $125 million spacecraft was lost because the two groups didn't establish a common context. While not a cultural misunderstanding in the national sense, it was a breakdown of implicit versus explicit assumptions, a failure to recognize the need for clarity in a mixed system. The same principle applies to human interactions. If you don't understand the context in which your words are received, you will miss the real message. Chris Voss, in Never Split the Difference, emphasizes tactical empathy in negotiation. He explains that the best communicators listen not just to what's being said, but to how it's being said, the pauses, the inflection, the underlying emotions. High-context cultures operate on this same level. If you expect a Japanese executive to tell you outright that they disagree, you'll wait forever. Disagreement comes in softened phrases like, "That will be difficult," or even silence. If you assume silence equals agreement, you will find yourself blindsided when the deal falls through. Contrast this with the Dutch, who value radical honesty. If they disagree, they will tell you to your face without hesitation. Two different worlds, two different maps of meaning. This same dynamic plays out in film and literature. In Lost in Translation, a movie about two Americans navigating Japan, entire conversations hinge on what remains unsaid. Bill Murray's character struggles to connect with those around him because he expects communication to be as direct as it is in the US. It isn't. The beauty of the film is in the quiet moments, the small gestures, the things not spoken aloud. If you don't train yourself to pick up on these signals, you will walk through the world missing half of every conversation. If you want to succeed in global business, or even just in cross-cultural friendships, You must adapt your communication style. Use precision in low-context cultures, where words carry all the weight, but rely on nuance in high-context settings, where silence, facial expressions, and phrasing determine the real meaning. If you expect directness from an indirect culture, you will miss everything unsaid. If you assume indirectness from a direct culture, you will read too much into words that mean exactly what they say. Listen not just to what is spoken, but to what is implied. Observe not just words, but tone, body language, and hesitation. Learn to read the air, or you'll find yourself speaking, but never truly communicating. Lesson 2, feedback isn't universal. You assume criticism works the same way everywhere, but one culture's constructive feedback is another's public humiliation. This assumption can destroy trust, stall careers, and unravel entire business deals. How people give and receive feedback is shaped by culture, and failing to recognize these differences is a guaranteed way to create resentment and confusion. The Dutch believe blunt feedback is a sign of honesty. If you're not direct, you're not being truthful. Americans soften criticism with praise, creating the infamous feedback sandwich. The Chinese avoid direct confrontation to maintain harmony. If you expect feedback to translate across cultures without adjustment, you will be misunderstood or, worse, resented. A British executive once told an Indian colleague, "That's an interesting idea." The Indian executive took this as a sign of approval, assuming that the idea would move forward. In reality, the British executive meant the idea was weak, but cultural politeness prevented a direct rejection. When nothing happened, the Indian professional felt misled, while the British executive assumed they had made their disapproval clear. This isn't just about different styles. It's about fundamentally different ways of expressing critique. Look at Ray Dalio's principles. His hedge fund, Bridgewater Associates, is built on radical transparency. Employees are expected to give and receive blunt, unfiltered criticism, no matter their rank. This works in a company where the culture supports it, but in a different context, this approach would be seen as brutal. Imagine implementing Dalio's radical transparency in a high-context culture like South Korea or Japan. The result wouldn't be productivity, it would be mass resignations. What one culture sees as honesty, another sees as disrespect. Consider Steve Jobs. His legendary perfectionism came with ruthless criticism. He didn't sugarcoat, and in the US, that directness was seen as tough but effective. If he had led a team in Thailand, where face-saving and indirect feedback are cultural norms, his approach would have alienated his employees. The lesson is clear. Feedback must be adjusted to fit the receiver's expectations. Kim Scott, in Radical Candor, argues for caring personally while challenging directly. But that balance isn't universal. Direct challenge in France is expected. In China, direct challenge can end a relationship. Erin Meyer's research shows that feedback lands differently based on cultural expectations. Americans expect constructive criticism wrapped in encouragement. The French expect blunt critique without softeners. The Chinese expect feedback to be delivered privately, indirectly, and with great care. Mismanaging feedback destroys trust. You must adapt. If you're working with a French team, expect candid critique. It's not personal. It's cultural. If you're leading in Japan, give feedback privately and diplomatically. If you work with Americans, balance negative feedback with positive reinforcement. Never assume that feedback translates without adjustment. Learn how different cultures expect to hear criticism, or risk losing respect. Lesson 3. Leadership is relative. Authority isn't universal. Some cultures expect hierarchy, while others demand equality. You can't lead effectively if you assume leadership looks the same everywhere. In Russia and China, leadership follows a top-down structure. Decisions come from the top, and subordinates expect clear direction. In Denmark and the Netherlands, leadership is about consensus. Managers don't command. They facilitate. A Brazilian manager once struggled in Sweden because employees openly questioned his directives. He saw it as insubordination. They saw it as collaboration. The result was a breakdown in trust and efficiency. If you misread expectations around leadership, you will fail. History offers endless examples of leadership styles clashing. Napoleon centralized power and expected absolute control. while the Scandinavian countries developed governance through consultation and equality. The contrast still plays out in modern leadership. Look at global corporations. In a Japanese company, the CEO is often revered as the final decision maker, expected to be distant and authoritative. In contrast, at a company like Google, leaders operate in open office spaces, engage in direct dialogue with employees, and invite dissent. If a hierarchical leader walks into a flat-structured team, they will be seen as authoritarian. If a consensus-driven leader enters a rigid hierarchy, they will be seen as weak. Research from Geert Hofstede's cultural dimensions theory reinforces this. Power distance, the degree to which societies accept unequal power distribution, determines how leadership is received. In high-power distance cultures like Mexico or Saudi Arabia, authority is respected and rarely questioned. Employees expect decisions to come from above. In low-power distance cultures like Sweden or Australia, employees question decisions, expect justifications, and view hierarchy as a temporary organizational tool rather than an inherent right. Steve Jobs' leadership worked in Apple's American innovation-driven structure, but it would have struggled in a culture where questioning leadership is seen as rebellion rather than engagement. Meyer compares leadership expectations to military structures, top-down command versus decentralized authority. In the U.S. military, decisions often rely on lower ranks taking initiative. In contrast, the Russian military traditionally centralizes control. This difference played out in the war in Ukraine. Rigid, top-down leadership struggled against a more adaptive, decentralized opponent. The lesson? Leadership is context-dependent. If you assume leadership is universal, you'll alienate employees or lose control. You must assess whether your team expects top-down authority or shared decision-making. Read the cultural landscape before enforcing leadership styles that won't fit. Adapt or be replaced. Lesson 4. Decisions depend on culture. You believe logic drives decisions, but different cultures define logic in different ways. Americans value speed and efficiency, decisions happen fast, and moving forward is better than overanalyzing. Germans demand process, decisions are meticulous, data-driven, and structured. The Chinese take a long-term, relationship-based approach. Decisions unfold over time, often in ways that outsiders don't immediately recognize. A French executive working with an American team once struggled because he expected long discussions before making choices. The Americans saw it as indecisiveness. The Frenchmen saw them as reckless. These differences aren't just habits. They are deeply ingrained cognitive patterns shaped by culture. Daniel Kahneman's thinking, Fast and Slow, explains that decision-making varies based on cognitive biases and environmental factors. Culture amplifies this. The American tendency toward fast thinking prioritizes gut instinct and quick execution. The German and Japanese preference for slow thinking values caution, deliberation, and consensus. If you rush a German, you'll lose trust. If you delay an American, they'll move on. Look at historical military strategy. In World War II, the German military followed Auftragstatik, a doctrine emphasizing structured but flexible decision-making at all levels. Leaders expected rigorous planning but allowed adaptability in execution. Meanwhile, Soviet military strategy relied on rigid top-down control. This same contrast exists in business today. American startups make rapid decisions, often pivoting based on market reactions. Japanese corporations, like Toyota, rely on the nemawashi process, extensive behind-the-scenes consensus building before any formal decision is made. Neither is inherently superior, but applying one in the wrong context leads to failure. Consider Elon Musk's leadership at Tesla. He moves fast, sometimes making billion-dollar decisions in minutes. In the US, this aligns with a culture of rapid execution. But when Tesla expanded to Germany, local teams clashed with Musk's speed-driven approach. German executives expected careful deliberation. Musk expected immediate action. The cultural mismatch created friction. If you don't recognize how different cultures approach decisions, you will create tension, misunderstandings, and failed initiatives. Learn the pace of decision-making in every culture you engage with. Slow down when necessary, speed up when required, and never assume one method is superior. Adapt or you will be outpaced by those who do. Lesson 5. Trust is built differently. You assume trust forms the same way everywhere. It doesn't. Trust is either built through competence or relationships, and different cultures prioritize one over the other. Americans and Germans build trust through reliability and expertise. If you demonstrate skill and efficiency, you are trusted. Chinese and Latin American professionals build trust through personal connections, shared experiences, mutual friends, and social bonding matter more than credentials. If you don't understand this difference, you will struggle to establish credibility in international business. A Brazilian executive once lost a Chinese deal because he focused only on business. His Chinese counterpart wanted dinners, conversations, and personal rapport first. The Brazilian saw this as wasted time. The Chinese executive saw the Brazilian as transactional and untrustworthy. The deal collapsed. Meyer's research proves that if you try to establish trust through logic in a relationship-driven culture, you will be seen as cold. If you expect personal bonding in a task-oriented culture, you will be seen as unprofessional. Stephen Covey's The Speed of Trust argues that credibility drives trust. This is true in competence-based cultures, but in relationship-based cultures, trust drives credibility. If people don't know you, they won't do business with you, no matter how competent you are. Look at Hollywood. Deals happen not just because of talent, but because of relationships. A director hires an actor they've worked with before because trust exists. The same happens in the Middle East or Latin America, where business negotiations often begin with long conversations about family and life before moving to contracts. Compare this to Silicon Valley. Venture capitalists invest in startups based on measurable competence, past success, technical ability, and market potential. There is little need for deep personal trust before making financial commitments. In contrast, a Saudi Arabian investor may expect months of personal engagement before agreeing to a deal. If you assume trust works the same everywhere, you'll always struggle to close deals or manage teams. You must decide whether trust means proving competence or building relationships. In Germany, showcase expertise. In China, invest time in relationships. In the US, demonstrate results. Misread this, and you will be seen as either untrustworthy or inefficient. Recognize how trust is built, or you will never earn it. Lesson 6. Disagreeing the right way. Conflict isn't universal. Some cultures embrace debate, while others see it as disrespect. If you assume disagreement means the same thing everywhere, you will either alienate your colleagues or be dismissed as weak. In Israel and France, argument fuels discussion and progress. Challenging ideas openly is expected. In Japan and Indonesia, confrontation signals rudeness and disrupts harmony. If you push back in the wrong way, you will not be seen as assertive, you will be seen as dangerous. A German executive once debated openly with a Korean colleague, assuming it was productive. The German believed argument sharpened ideas, while the Korean saw it as a direct attack and withdrew. The result wasn't progress, it was silence. Cultural framing determines whether conflict strengthens or damages relationships. If you expect every culture to handle disagreement like your own, you will destroy trust without realizing it. Consider the American courtroom drama, A Few Good Men. The climactic exchange between Tom Cruise's character and Jack Nicholson's Colonel Jessup is explosive. The direct confrontation forces the truth into the open, which is exactly how argument works in an American context. Aggressive questioning is seen as a way to expose weakness and establish credibility. Now imagine that scene in a Japanese setting. There would be no shouting, no grand challenge. The truth would be revealed through indirect statements, subtle cues, and carefully chosen words. A direct assault would be a failure of decorum, not a victory. In difficult conversations, Douglas Stone explains that managing disagreement is about framing. You must frame conflict in a way that aligns with cultural expectations. Meyer expands on this by showing that in some cultures, pushing too hard will break trust, while in others, staying too silent will make you seem weak. The US and Germany value direct debate. If you disagree, you say so clearly. France encourages intellectual combat, where ideas are tested through vigorous discussion. In contrast, China and Thailand value harmony, where disagreements happen privately and indirectly. Look at global diplomacy. In Western negotiations, open confrontation is part of the process. In Eastern negotiations, losing face is unacceptable. Henry Kissinger, one of history's most skilled diplomats, mastered the art of adjusting to different cultural expectations. When negotiating with China, he avoided direct confrontation, instead using careful language and indirect suggestions. If he had used the same tactics he used with the Soviet Union, the talks would have collapsed. You must know if the culture you're engaging with values debate or harmony. Push too hard in a conflict-averse culture, and you'll break trust. Stay too silent in a confrontational culture, and you'll seem weak. Read the room. Understand the rules. Disagree strategically. Lesson 7. Perceptions of time shape work. Time is relative. Some cultures prioritize punctuality, while others see time as fluid. If you impose your own view of time on a culture that operates differently, you will be seen as either rude or inefficient. Americans and Germans schedule everything down to the minute. Meetings start precisely on time, deadlines are strict, and being late is a sign of disrespect. In India and Latin America, time is flexible, relationships take precedence, and schedules shift based on context. A Swiss executive working in Nigeria grew frustrated when meetings started late. His Nigerian counterparts weren't being unprofessional. They simply had a different relationship with time. This isn't just cultural, it's neurological. In When by Daniel Pink, he explains that different people function optimally at different times of the day. Meyer takes it further by showing that entire cultures function on different time expectations. Some cultures treat time as linear. A schedule is a fixed structure that must be followed. Others treat time as cyclical. Events unfold naturally, and flexibility allows for better outcomes. Look at international business. In Japan, punctuality is a sign of discipline. If a train is delayed by even a minute, an apology is issued. In contrast, in Brazil, a meeting time is a suggestion, not a rigid requirement. If you treat a flexible time culture with the same rigidity as a structured time culture, you will either offend or be frustrated. Consider the 2012 London Olympics, where American and British event organizers clashed with Brazilian teams over scheduling. The Western teams expected precision. The Brazilian teams prioritized adaptability. The result was miscommunication, missed deadlines, and frustration. Neither side was wrong. They simply operated on different time perspectives. This difference even appears in literature. In 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, time moves fluidly, with events repeating and overlapping in a nonlinear fashion. This reflects the Latin American perspective on time, not as a strict sequence of events, but as something flexible and influenced by human relationships. If you impose rigid scheduling on a flexible time culture, you'll be seen as pushy. If you expect fluidity in a structured time culture, you'll be seen as unreliable. Learn the time expectations of every culture you work with, or you'll always be out of sync. Lesson 8. Navigating global collaboration. Remote teams and global partnerships require a hybrid cultural approach. You might manage a team with Americans, French, Indians, and Chinese professionals all working together. If you assume everyone operates by the same rules, you will create frustration and inefficiency. A single misstep, whether it's how you phrase an email, structure a meeting, or interpret silence, can derail everything. One international project Meyer observed failed because the American team assumed silence meant agreement. The Japanese team, however, saw silence as contemplation. When decisions came, the Japanese felt ignored, while the Americans felt misled. This echoes Edward T. Hall's research in Beyond Culture, which proves that communication is deeply contextual. In a high-context culture, silence can mean respect or deep thinking. In a low-context culture, silence means confusion or disinterest. This plays out in how different cultures handle virtual meetings. Americans and Germans expect quick responses and decisive action. Chinese and Indian teams often require extended discussions and approval from multiple levels before moving forward. If you assume that a lack of immediate response means a lack of interest, you will make critical mistakes. Consider the failure of Daimler-Chrysler's merger. The German and American executives clashed over leadership styles, decision-making processes, and communication norms. Daimler, rooted in German precision and hierarchy, expected careful deliberation. Chrysler, accustomed to American agility, expected fast decisions. The cultural misalignment led to inefficiency, mistrust, and eventually the collapse of the merger. If two corporate giants couldn't navigate cultural differences, how can you expect a remote team of diverse backgrounds to function without deliberate adaptation? Look at how Pixar and Disney merged under the leadership of Ed Catmull and Steve Jobs. Pixar had a culture of open, direct feedback, while Disney had a more hierarchical structure. Catmull didn't force one culture onto the other. He created a hybrid approach that allowed both teams to thrive. That's the only way global collaboration succeeds. If you expect a single cultural norm to dominate, you will alienate half your team. If you misinterpret silence, pacing, or communication styles, you will cause confusion. You need to recognize and adapt to each culture's expectations in virtual collaboration. Misinterpret one cue, and the entire team collapses. Your job is to bridge cultural gaps, not widen them. Conclusion. Culture is not an obstacle, it's a map. Every country, company, and team operates within its own set of unwritten rules. Ignore them, and you'll miscommunicate, mismanage, and fail. Master them, and you'll lead, negotiate, and collaborate at the highest level. Erin Meyer's research proves that no single approach works everywhere. You must be agile, observant, and intentional. If you want to succeed in global business, stop assuming your way is the only way. Read the culture map to gain the full depth of Meyer's insights. Every conversation, deal, and relationship depends on your ability to decode cultural signals. Adapt or be left behind. The end.